Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have an informative presentation for you today titled Safe in Sound, the Hidden Hazards of Noise. So I wanted to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Taylor Broughton. She is one of our occupational hygienists here at ECHO. She recently completed her Master of Public Health program in Occupational and Environmental Health at the University of Toronto. And she was awarded the 2022 Occupational Hygiene Association of Ontario Student Award of Excellence in Occupational Hygiene for her academic achievements. Taylor's experience across a wide variety of occupational hygiene projects includes noise surveys, ergonomic assessments, occupational exposure monitoring, indoor air quality, or IAQ, and mold and water damage investigations. And then Michelle Mendoza, our other presenter today, is in addition to being ECHO's senior occupational hygienist, she also is a sessional lecturer at the G. Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education at Toronto Metropolitan University, which used to be Ryerson. For over 9 years, Michelle has worked on a variety of occupational hygiene projects, noise surveys, IAQ assessments, mold and water damage, and occupational exposure monitoring. So both of these presenters today have a lot of expertise and experience with a lot of occupational hygiene questions. So feel free to ask any questions about any of these. But today we're going to be focusing on noise. And so to our agenda, we are going to touch on a slight intro to ECHO, who we are and what we do. And then Taylor and Michelle will take over from there and talk about what is noise, the health effects of noise, some of the regulations surrounding noise, how to measure and how to control noise. And so ECHO. ECHO is an environmental consulting, occupational health and safety firm. We were founded in 2000, and we have service hubs here in Mississauga and in Ottawa as well. With more than 75 employees with professional accreditations, we serve client sectors that include building, property and real estate management, construction, education, facility and property managers, government and institutions, healthcare facilities, industrial, manufacturing, and insurance. We have 3 main service lines. We do a lot of environmental work, including phase 1, phase 2, and environmental site assessments. We have qualified persons under the Act who can do record of site conditions, different soil and groundwater remediation, potable water assessments, and many others. Our hazardous materials division does designated substances surveys, so asbestos, lead, and a variety of other hazardous materials. And then occupational health and safety, we do a lot of different safety audits, water damage assessments, mold and bacteria sampling, indoor air quality assessments, and noise and radon surveys and investigations, as well as some others. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Taylor, who is going to be talking to us about noise, what it is, and some of the health effects. Thank you so much, Taylor.
Thank you for that introduction, Naomi, and I'm happy to get us started in our webinar today. So the first thing we wanted to talk about today was what is noise, and specifically differentiating between noise and sound, because many people, including myself, have used these terms interchangeably, and they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So noise is any unwanted sound, while sound is what our ears hear. So in this sense, all noise is sound, but not all sound is noise. For example, I like to play country music in my car, and to me that would be sound, but to someone else that might be noise. Now, sound comes in a variety of frequencies. We have a fairly large range that's detectable by the human ear, ranging from about 20 to 20,000 hertz. However, the most common frequencies in our activities of daily living tend to range from 250 to about 6,000 hertz. Now, exposure to noise is just not limited to the workplace. It occurs everywhere and it affects everyone. And exposure to sound can be continuous, so occurring over a period of time, intermittent, where it happens periodically at different times, and impulsive, where it's instantaneous, say like an explosion. Now, I definitely wanted to touch on some statistics from the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, or WSIB. So for those of you not familiar with the WSIB, it is a agency in the province of Ontario specifically that looks after workers who have become injured or have developed an illness in the workplace. And they provide things like loss of earning benefits and healthcare benefits. So noise-induced hearing loss can be classified as an occupational disease by the WSIB. And by an occupational disease, I mean a disease that has developed due to exposure to a workplace hazard. And noise-induced hearing loss is one of the most common occupational disease claims that is filed with the WSIB. Now, since 2012, there's been over 54,000 claims for noise-induced hearing loss that have been filed, which accounts for about 1/4 of all occupational disease claims. And the number of claims for noise-induced hearing loss that have been filed per year have nearly doubled in this 10-year span. And even looking at data from the first 2 months of this year, there's been over 630 claims for noise-induced hearing loss filed. Now, here I'm speaking very broadly about WSIB as a whole, but we can delve a little bit deeper into specific WSIB classes to look at some trends across the industries. So here we're looking at Class D1, which is educational services. Now the graph on the screen here is showing the allowed occupational disease claims for the last 3 years. So you'll notice that each bar has 2 separate colors. You have the blue bar, which represents other occupational disease claims. This can include claims related to, say, COVID-19, asbestosis, and silicosis, just to name a few, while the gray portions of the bar represent claims related to noise-induced hearing loss. So specifically for the educational services sector, we can see that the majority of occupational disease claims are not related to noise-induced hearing loss. Rather, it's about 1/6 of all occupational disease claims being related to noise. However, if we move to another class, such as Class G2, which is infrastructure construction, not only are we seeing the total number of claims for occupational disease increasing, but we're also seeing a higher proportion of those related to noise-induced hearing loss. So now we're at about 1/3 to 1/4, even closer maybe to 1/2 in some cases, of noise-induced hearing loss claims as a whole of all the claims there. And finally, we can look at a third class, Class E5, which would be machinery, electrical equipment, and miscellaneous manufacturing. Now, this example is probably the best in showing that these number of claims vary per year. So for 2020 and 2022, we see a fairly similar amount of claims here, but in 2021, this number has definitely jumped. So in 2020 and 2022, we're seeing about half of all occupational disease claims being related to noise, while in 2021, we're seeing closer to about 1/5. And all of this information is freely available on the WSIB website. So if you do have an interest in looking, say, at the specific class for your business, I would highly encourage you to do that. So now that we understand some of the background on what is sound and the impact that it can have through the WSIB lens, it's important to understand how we actually hear sound. So on the left here, we have some sound waves moving towards the pinna, which is the scientific term for the external ear. So the portion of the ear on the outside of your head. And if you'll notice, the pinna, it has many different ridges and grooves, and this is by design because the role of the outer ear is to try and collect and funnel all these sound waves towards the ear canal here. So as these sound waves are channeled towards the ear canal, it amplifies and it directs all of these sound waves down to a membrane called the eardrum. Now, similar to how it would be if you were drumming, as the sound waves hit the eardrum, it causes it to vibrate. And this eardrum then causes the vibration of 3 small bones in the inner ear, known as the malleus, incus, and stapes here. These bones are incredibly tiny, only about the size of your pinky. And what they do is they transmit the sound from traveling in air to then be able to travel through a fluid, which is housed within the cochlea here. Kind of looks like a snail shell. So as you have this stapes impacting against the cochlea here, they're creating waves in the fluid within the cochlea. And these waves then travel throughout the cochlea to structures known as hair cells. Now, hair cells what they do is when the waves come at them, they deflect. So they lean in the direction of the wave. And as they deflect, they create what is known as a depolarization. And the depolarization is just a fancy way of saying it generates a nerve impulse, which then is transmitted along the auditory nerve all the way up to the brain, where then it can be processed for us to be able to interpret, what sound we're actually hearing. So speaking of the perception of loudness, just sort of understanding this because it is a little bit counterintuitive. So loudness is a subjective term, and this is associated with what we say as an auditory sensation. So because it's subjective, it's different for everyone else. And because we want to be measuring it and be able to compare it across different places, different rooms, different organizations, we need to find a way that we can measure it collectively across this region, which is why we use different terms such as sound pressure level, for example. And these are all expressed in decibels. Now, although they're not exactly loudness, they do relate back to loudness. So loudness in this way is expressed in decibels. And the interesting thing about decibels is that they use a logarithmic scale rather than a linear scale. So on our typical linear scale, we would say that 2 is twice as much as 1, but with a logarithmic scale, it doesn't quite work this way. Instead, on a logarithmic scale, there has to be a difference of 10 for something to be twice as loud. So we would say that 40 decibels would be twice as loud as 30 decibels. Now, to better illustrate this, we've got some examples of some common things that we'll see in our daily lives. So let's take a ticking watch, for example. A ticking watch is about 20 decibels. And if we compare this to a normal conversation at 60 decibels, this is a difference of 40 decibels. So because of the difference in 40 decibels, a normal conversation will be about 16 times louder than a ticking watch. Now, if we compare a normal conversation, which again is at 60, to fireworks, which can range from about 140 to 150 decibels, the fireworks would be over 500 times louder than a normal conversation. And just for interest's sake, if we go from a ticking watch to fireworks, the fireworks will be over 8,000 times louder than a ticking watch. So hopefully this helps to put noise into perspective, just because it is a little counterintuitive with how the decibel scale works. So now I wanted to move into health effects of noise, first starting with differentiating between some types of hearing loss. So the first type of hearing loss I wanted to talk about was conductive hearing loss. And this type affects the outer and the middle ear. So it'll affect this external ear here, the ear canal, and the ossicles, which were those tiny bones in the middle ear. And this type of hearing loss can be due to things such as middle ear or upper respiratory tract infections, excess earwax, trauma, or osteosclerosis of the ossicles. And osteosclerosis is just a hardening of the bones, which means that they can't really conduct those vibrations as well as they could. This type of hearing loss is generally not associated with noise-induced hearing loss. The second type, however, is sensory neural hearing loss. And this affects the inner ear. So this would affect the cochlea, which was that fluid-filled structure with the hair cells, and it affects all the way up to the brain. So at any point along that would be sensory neural hearing loss. And this type of hearing loss can be due to things such as age, autotoxicants, traumatic brain injuries, metabolic disorders, or noise. So because it's associated with noise, this is what we're looking for when we're talking about noise-induced hearing loss. The second set of types of hearing loss that I wanted to differentiate between are age-induced and noise-induced, just because when I'm out in the field, I do tend to get a lot of questions about, well, could this be age-induced or is this noise-induced? So to start off with age-induced, this is a type of sensory neural hearing loss. So it is affecting the inner ear as well as up into the brain. It can be associated with tinnitus, so that ringing in the ears. And age-induced hearing loss is primarily associated with age-related changes within the inner ear, but it can also be influenced by other factors as well. And in terms of the pattern of loss, this generally happens at higher frequencies. So the frequencies above 1,000 hertz are where people are going to be noticing that most of their hearing loss is occurring. Now, to look at noise-induced hearing loss, it is similar to age-induced hearing loss because it is a type of sensorineural hearing loss and it can be associated with tinnitus. However, what it's caused by and how it presents are where it differs. So noise-induced hearing loss is caused by exposure to impact noise, so say gunshots or explosions, or continuous noise, say over a working lifetime. And then the hearing loss that one would see would be predominantly right around 4,000 hertz, which is often referred to as the 4,000 hertz notch. And it's also associated with frequencies of previous noise exposure. So say you worked in the same environment for 20 years, and there's one particular piece of equipment that operates at, say, 1,000 hertz, you might see that the hearing loss particularly affecting that 1,000 hertz area. Now, regardless of if it's age-induced or noise-induced, both types of hearing loss can have significant impacts on a person's quality of life. So now moving into the health effects of noise, I'm going to start off with the auditory effects, just because these are the ones that people are most familiar with and most closely associate with exposure to noise. So the first one is tinnitus, and this is the ringing in the ears. So this sensation of ringing in the ears can either be continuous, where it's happening over an extended period of time and it's happening all the time, or it can be more intermittent, where it's happening only at certain times or for short periods of time. Tinnitus generally matches the frequency of previous noise exposure. So if you were to compare the frequency of the ringing in the ears that you're perceiving compared to the frequency of previous noise exposure, they would be approximately the same. The second type here is temporary threshold shift, which is otherwise known as temporary hearing loss. So with this temporary hearing loss, this is occurring due to exposure over a short period of time. The best two examples I like to give are, say, going to a Leafs game or going to a concert, where you're there for a couple of hours and you walk out and your ears feel full and it's a little more difficult to hear. Now, the reason why your ears feel full and it's a little more difficult to hear is because of the protective mechanism that the hair cells undergo. So these hair cells, if we remember back to our anatomy slides, they deflect as these waves of fluid come by in the cochlea. But what happens is when you're exposed to noise in this short period of time is they actually stiffen up. So it's harder for them to deflect. So you're not actually perceiving noise as you normally would. It would have to be a higher, it would have to be more noise for you to be exposed to in order to perceive it to the same extent that you did previously. Now, because it is only temporary, there is a sense of recovery here, where once you leave this environment, within 1 to 2 hours, generally most of your hearing at this level will return, but it can take as long as 48 hours for recovery to be complete. And then the third type here is the permanent threshold shift, which is also known as permanent hearing loss or noise-induced hearing loss. Now, this type is associated with either continuous exposure over an extended period of time, say someone's working lifetime, or by impulse noise, say explosions or gunshots, etc. Now, because it's permanent, there is no sense of recovery here. So these hair cells have been deflected beyond their normal range, either too often, or if it's an impulse noise, too much at one time, that they become damaged and are then replaced with scar tissue, which doesn't allow them to deflect anymore, which means that you can no longer perceive sound in that area. One other health effect that's important to talk about is ototoxins. So ototoxins are substances that either cause or will worsen hearing loss. And there's over 100 substances that can be found in workplaces that are ototoxic and over 200 medications. And there's broadly 5 classes of ototoxins, which include pharmaceuticals, so certain antibiotics, diuretics, and chemotherapy drugs, solvents such as styrene and toluene, asphyxiants like carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, nitriles, and metals and metal compounds such as lead and mercury. Now moving away from the auditory effects to the non-auditory effects. So very broadly, you can group these into health effects versus other effects. And I'll start off with the health effects first. So this is really a new area of research where there's been a lot more emphasis placed in this area because we've understood the auditory effects for so long. People are beginning to explore the effects that it can have on other body systems. So they found that noise can be associated with cardiovascular diseases such as hypertension and coronary heart disease, pulmonary diseases like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, like aka COPD, stress-related ulcers in the stomach and the upper small intestine, insulin resistance, which can increase someone's likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes, psychological impacts, so those related to mental health, as well as the disruption of sleep patterns. Now, I also included the other effects because although they may not necessarily affect one's health, they can definitely impact someone's quality of life. And these effects can include increased accident and error rates, reduced productivity, reduced concentration, delays in language and speech development in children, and perhaps the one that we're the most familiar with and everyone has experienced, annoyance. So now I'm going to pass it over to Michelle, who's going to take us through regulations, measurement, and noise control.
Right. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks again for that excellent overview of noise and its health effects. So in this section of the webinar, I'll be talking about the regulations around noise, how we measure noise, including the types of equipment that we use, and finally discuss the kind of controls that we can implement to reduce excessive noise in the workplace or community. So let's start with regulations surrounding noise. We can broadly divide that into two categories: regulations around noise in the workplace and then guidelines in the community. So let's start with the regulations around the workplace. So where do you find the regulations? Well, it really depends on the kind of workplace that you're in. So if you're a federally regulated workplace, so those are banks, radio and TV broadcasters, airports, and postal offices, those are federally regulated workplaces. And you can find the requirements under the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulation, SOR 86, Part 7. And there it says that workers shall not be exposed to over 87 decibels over a 24-hour period. Now, most workplaces in Ontario are provincially regulated, and then we can find those regulations under Ontario Regulation 381, noise. And there it says workers shall not be exposed to over 85 decibels over an 8-hour period. So there is a bit of difference in terms of the time. Both of these regulations are fairly similar. Both of them do say that the employer must take every reasonable precaution to limit the exposure to noise of its workers. There also are requirements around signage. So in areas where you do identify as over the exposure limit, there needs to be clear signage indicating that this is a noise hazard and that the proper PPE is in place. Similarly, providing workers with appropriate PPE, whether that's earplugs or earmuffs or dual protection, which we will talk about later on in this webinar. Really, the difference between these two regulations is how it's written. If you are looking at the federal regulation, it's a bit more prescriptive. It tells you the specific CSA standards that you need to follow, which are listed down here. For example, it will explicitly say that you need to follow the CSA standard Z10756 for carrying out noise measurements, as well as referring directly to the CSA standard Z94 hearing protected devices, performance, selection, use, and care. The Ontario regulation is not as descriptive. It just tells you the certain things that you need to achieve in order to reach compliance with the regulation. Now, what about in our communities? So the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change has a guideline for community noise. And this is for industrial or commercial establishments and setting limits so that they're not so noisy around their neighbors and community settings. So depending on where these establishments are And the type of establishment, the range can be either 40 to 60 decibels. And then obviously we've also got our local bylaws. So our towns and cities have regulations in terms of how loud we can be and when we're allowed to be making noise. So one that you might be familiar with are the construction bylaws. So for example, in the city of Toronto, there are noise prohibitions between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Monday through Friday, and similarly 7 p.m. to 9 a.m. on weekends and stat holidays. As well as in the city of Toronto, we have a bylaw that prohibits motorcycle exhaust so that it should not exceed 95 decibels while motorcycles are idling. So what about some standards in terms of guiding principles to design less noisy work environments? Like I mentioned before, you can refer to the CSA standard to help you decide the types of protective equipment, how we select them, care for them, and use them. There's also design guidelines. So you can refer to the Acoustical Society of America, and they've got excellent resources for designing less noisy classrooms and schools. So they've got recommendations for the type of material that can use, the recommended reverberation time. So reverberation time is the time it takes for an echo to dissipate. So there's different numbers depending on the type of room you have in a school. For instance, a cafeteria versus an auditorium versus a music classroom versus a regular classroom. We can also look to the World Health Organization, and they have established environmental limits for community noise around airports, roads and highways, train stations as well. Oh, there we go. Okay. So now that we know about the limits around noise, how do we measure if there is a problem in our workplace or in a community? Well, we can use two different types of instruments. We've got sound level meters and dosimeters. So essentially, these are microphones that detect difference in pressure waves and convert that into electrical signal, which gives you the decibel reading. So starting with the sound level meter, these are handheld instruments. They can either give you instantaneous measurements, or they can be integrated, which means that you can set them up to record over a certain duration of time to measure the sound level in a particular area. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that red and gray device. Those are examples of some sound level meters. And we can divide those further into class 1 or class 2. So class 1 sound level meters, these are more precise, and these are typically used in environmental noise studies as well as building acoustics. Because of their better precision, these are also used for lab studies and calibration purposes. Class 2 sound level meters have a wider range of frequencies, so those are used in occupational noise surveys. Next, we have dosimeters. So you can see pictured at the bottom, there's a gentleman with a dosimeter. So we attach that to the worker's hearing zone. The hearing zone is either around their worker's ears. So typically we clip those onto the shoulder or the shirt lapel, just so that's close to that region. And these measure the individual's exposure over a certain sample duration. And it can also extrapolate that sound exposure to an 8-hour work period. You can also get different kinds of sound level meters and dosimeters with additional features, particularly ones with octave band frequency analysis. So octave band analysis means that we can measure the intensity of different sounds, intensity of different frequencies by different groups. So like as Taylor mentioned earlier, if you're starting to lose hearing at the 1000 hertz frequency, if you have octave band analysis, you can measure the intensity of that loudness compared to other frequency ranges to see if there's a particular problem with particular frequency in the area that you're studying. Now, what about smartphone apps? I'm sure if you go to the app store, you can search in sound level meter and like thousands of these kinds of apps will pop up. Not necessarily the most accurate things because these are not calibrated. Unlike sound level meters and dosimeters, we pre and post calibrate those every time we use them to make sure that they're adequately calibrated. Smartphone sound level apps don't necessarily have that. And according to WorkSafe BC, they have a margin of error up to 10 decibels. So it's quite a large error. So delving deeper into noise measurements, what exactly are we measuring and what do we do with this information? So typically we measure the noise of human hearing. We want to see like how that's affecting individuals. So we typically set the sound level meter or the noise dosimeter to the A frequency weighting, or typically known as A weighting. And this is because the A weighting covers the frequencies of human hearing. Like Taylor mentioned, that's between 20 to 20,000 hertz. There are other weighting scales, B weighting scale, C weighting scale, and Z weighting scale, but those are not typically used. With sound level meters and dosimeters, we can set the response time to either fast, slow, or impact. A sound level meter that has a slow setting has a 1 second response time. This means that it will take 1 second for sound level meters to get up to a level of constant tone. So these are good for ignoring those short, fast sounds like slamming doors, popping balloons, and they give you a good range for studying sound over several hours or even up to a few days, depending on how long you want to study the sound for. A sound level meter that has a fast response time can detect sounds within 125 milliseconds. So that's 8 times faster than the slow weighting response, relatively, because 1 second is still pretty quick. And lastly, we have impact, and this is the least common of these 3 weightings, and it's designed to capture sound levels for short sounds such as gunshots and explosions. Other parameters that we look at when we conduct noise surveys are the LEQ, so that's your equivalent sound level, and that's the exposure over the sample duration. There's the LEX, that's the exposure level, so we are extrapolating the sample duration over an 8-hour period, which is what we use for a typical workday. There's also the dose, which is the amount a worker receives relative to the allowable limit. So allowable limit would be 85 decibels in provincially regulated workplaces and 87 in federally regulated workplaces. And certainly if you have your own internal policy that wants to be a bit more conservative, you could make changes to review the dose relative to the internal policy. And lastly, there's thresholds. So we can set sound level meters and dosimeters to measure certain thresholds. So if it's below, say, for instance, we set the sound level meter or dosimeter to 50 decibels, any sound below that will not be registered by these devices. So after we've collected our noise data, if we're doing spot measurements, we can read that right away on the instrument and make comparisons to whatever regulations we are comparing them against. However, if we're doing longer term studies over a few hours, few days, then we need to download the information from sound level meters and noise dosimeters onto a computer, and they will generate all these different parameters that I've mentioned before. And what we're really looking at is whether the sound is over, in most workplaces, like I said, 85 decibels over the 8-hour period. So if it's over 85 decibels, then that means that workers are being overexposed to noise. And if you're overexposed to noise, then we can apply the 3 decibel exchange rule. So here's a little graphic of how the 3 decibel exchange rule works. So looking at the very top, we have 85 decibels. So like I said, in Ontario, the occupational exposure limit for noise over 8 hours is 85 decibels. Now, if your sound level meter or your noise dosimeter tells you that you are having a continuous noise of 88 decibels, that's 3 decibels more than 85. 85 plus 3 is 88. Now we have to take half of the allowable exposure limit at 8 hours and cut that into 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. So if you have continuous noise at 88 decibels, you should only be exposed to that amount of sound for 4 hours. Now, if you increase it again to 3 more decibels, so 85 plus 3 is 88, plus another 3 is 91, we'll go back to our permissible exposure limit. We know that we're allowed up to 85 decibels over 8 hours. Cut that in half by 2, which gives us 4. And then we cut it again by half. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So if we're getting continuous noise at 91 decibels, then we should only be exposed to that level of sound for 2 hours. So the trend basically is the louder it gets, the less time you need to be spending in that environment. Otherwise, you're increasing your risk for noise-related illnesses, such as different types of noise-induced hearing losses. So now that we've identified there might be a problem with excessive noise in our workplace or environment, how do we control this? So we look to our handy dandy hierarchy controls, starting with elimination. So elimination means we're removing the noisy source from that environment. And that might work if you are, say, in an office and you maybe relocate the individual to a different office. But in most settings, that's not practical because often workers are using or working around different pieces of equipment and machinery. So the next thing we have to look at in our hierarchy is perhaps doing substitution. So that could be replacing the source with a less noisy one, replacing fuel or pneumatic power tools with electric tools, switching metal chutes to rubber or plastic. So a good example of that would be if you've ever seen roofers working on a roof, and I'm sure now that summer's coming up, you might see that a lot more. They often have those yellow plastic chutes that are connected from the roof down to their waste bin. That way that when things are being dropped down that chute, it's not clinking and clanking as much as if it were a metal chute. And another option for substitution could be replacing forging and hammering processes with pressing and gluing processes. Next down the line of our controls, we've got engineering. So ideally, if we are designing, say, a workplace or a workstation, we want to incorporate those engineering controls at the design phase. So that way, by the time people are actually interacting with the equipment, those controls are in place. Now, if you kind of come to that point after the fact, then there are several options to control noise through engineering. So that could be enclosing machinery, using a control room. So in the picture here, you've got a control room that's basically isolating the workers so they can still see what's going on kind of on the main floor, but the noise is being reduced in their specific work area. You could also install liners in ductwork so that it muffles any sound that's flowing through the ductwork, and making sure you have well-maintained gears, pulleys, belts, according to the manufacturer's recommendations. So routinely doing ongoing maintenance. In addition to engineering controls, we also want to apply administrative controls. So this would include job rotation. So if we know that a particular piece of equipment is excessive of the regulatory limit, we'll want to ensure that workers are not spending their whole day in and around that piece of equipment. So instead of working there 8 hours, maybe say they only work there for 4 hours, 2 hours, but definitely less than the permissible exposure limit. We can also place signage on locations where we know there are noise hazards. And this is, like I said earlier, a regulatory requirement for both federally and provincially regulated workplaces. We can issue our workers with hearing protected devices. So those are your earplugs and your earmuffs, and giving them the training so that they know how to properly use and care for them. We can also have medical surveillance programs. So that's typically done by an audiologist who will conduct audiograms, and they can compare how well your hearing is, say, when you first started the job versus a couple years down the line to see if there's any changes. And finally, developing a hearing and conservation program. Last but not least, we've got PPE, our personal protective equipment. And we can divide them into two broad categories. We've got your earplugs and your earmuffs. Earplugs are advantageous because they're reusable, they're disposable, they're easy to carry. In some cases, you can also get custom earplugs, but they do take time to insert properly, and you can't be using these in work areas where you know the sound is over 105 decibels. We also have earmuffs. So these are good for low frequencies. These cover your outer ear in contrast to earplugs, which go into your ear canal. Earmuffs generally are a one-size-fits-all solution. However, we need to be mindful if we are, say, wearing safety glasses or hard hats that might affect the seal around the earmuffs. In workplaces where the sound level is routinely over 100 decibels, and commonly you find that in mining industry, you can apply both hearing protection together. So that would be earplugs and then earmuffs over top. Now, when it comes to selecting the type of hearing protection, each hearing protective device has a noise reduction rating, NRR. So you can see on the earmuffs over there, there's a number on the side. It might be a little bit hard to see. It says 101. So depending on the make and the manufacturer, the noise reduction rating can range from 22 to 33 decibels. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the noise reduction rating is that this number is created in an ideal laboratory setting, but we're working in the real world where there's a lot of different things going on. So we can't simply just subtract whatever noise we have in our workplace or whatever environment we're in with the noise reduction rating. We have to refer to the CSA standard, which tells us the correction factor depending on if you're using earmuffs, earplugs, or both. So as you can see, over our 20 years of experience, ECHO has provided several noise surveys. It's clearly a common hazard, not just in workplaces, but as well as in our community setting. Just to quickly give you an overview of some stuff we've done recently, a couple of months ago, Taylor and I were out at a sorting facility doing some noise surveys for a client who wanted to see how noisy the equipment was running before they started to have their workers in there. So we were taking background measurements with all the equipment off and comparing that with the conveyor belts running and with their test material on the conveyor belts to see if there is a difference. And this is just with no one actually working quite yet. So just looking at what is the sound looking like with just the equipment running. We've also done personal noise dosimetry. Recently, I went to a garment factory and the employer in this case was looking to see what are the noise exposure levels to their embroiderers and their sewing machine operators, just to see what the difference is, if there was any, and were they being overexposed to the interior limit. And another example that we've done recently are some noise monitoring in schools. Recently, I went to a couple of schools in the GTA to measure how loud it is in kindergarten classroom. You would think with like the 25 to 30 kids, it can be loud certain times of day, especially if it's like a pizza day, or I went to one where they had indoor recess. So I think the kids were getting a little antsy just being stuck inside all day. But generally speaking, we found that in this particular study, the teachers and the early childhood educators that worked with them were within the allowable limit. So in summary, if you have any questions about workplace or community noise, ECHO is here to help. And with that, I'll pass it back to Naomi.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Taylor. We have an opportunity now to ask these two experts some questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or pop them in the Q&A chat, which you'll see in your Zoom toolbar down the bottom. I learned a lot in that. I was really fascinated to learn about how the ear works a little more. So I'll definitely take some earplugs to the next concert I go to. But we did have a question come up from Daniel Molnar. So Daniel, if you're on the line, this question, curious, he says, if the classes of WSIB G2 and E5 mentioned are specific in relation to Ontario, or are they broadly accepted across Canada and North America? I think this is probably based on your presentation part, Taylor.
Yeah, and great question. I know that I've definitely asked myself this question before. So the classes that I was listing in this presentation, those are specific to Ontario. So workers' compensation boards are provincial or territorial jurisdiction, except for federally regulated workers, then that goes federally. So there are differences. There's really no clear line of, yes, this G2 means infrastructure construction across every province and territory, so it does make it a little bit more difficult to compare for sure.
Oh, thank you. We have another question come in from an anonymous attendee. They say, our maintenance staff regularly enters mechanical boiler rooms at various buildings. We have never had the sound levels tested in these boiler rooms. Staff may spend 5 minutes in these rooms or several hours. Is it required that we test sound levels in these rooms? And I'm not sure.
I can answer that. Yeah, so like I said, the Ontario regulation requires that employers take every reasonable precaution to ensure that their workers are not exposed to noise hazards. So one way to do that is by doing a baseline study just to see what the noise levels are depending on different scenarios. So maybe it's during a routine maintenance operation, then we can take samples during that particular time. Or maybe it's like the machinery are always running, so we can take sound level measurements, in that room just to see what the sound level is looking like in there. And then further to that, if there is, say, it's an exceedance to the regulatory limits, then we can help you design different controls to reduce the noise.
So just, I guess, on that question as well, this ties in, but how often would a noise survey be required, and for how many employees?
So in the regulation, there's no set time period. It's not like asbestos where you need to do annual reassessment surveys, but it is recommended that anytime there's a change in process that you come back and do a survey just to see if there are any differences, because maybe you've installed a new piece of machinery that is, maybe it's quieter. So now we want to know what's the difference.
So no particular sort of requirement in terms of it has to be done and when it has to be done, but if there's any kind of risk of it being over that exposure limit, then you're required by the regulation to do it.
That's correct. And further to that, if in federally regulated workplaces, when you do collect a noise survey, you do need to share that with your joint health and safety committee, just so that they have that awareness of what's been done, what has been found, and what you are planning to do about it.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Sabine Mayers, she says, great info, thank you very much. She runs a doggy daycare, and she's often wondering if the dog's barking might be doing damage to my hearing. Taylor, do you have any insights for Sabine? It's a really good question. Dogs can be loud.
Yeah, no, it'll all depend on, again, like how loud the dog is barking and, how often. So is it limited to, say, a period of a couple of minutes every hour, or is it more continuously all throughout the day? Just because the 85 decibels that Michelle's referring to for Ontario, it is averaged over an 8-hour day. So it does take into consideration, maybe there are periods where it's a little bit quieter, maybe not, but if you are concerned, I would definitely recommend looking into it.
Thanks, Taylor. Sid Gohill asks, I work in a metal industry looking for control measures to reduce noise when parts are hitting at the base of empty bins coming out of the conveyor. The current noise level we have in the plant is 90 dBA. So I don't know if that's so much a question as a sort of request for a little bit more information. So I'm going to suggest, Sid, if you'd like to reach out to our presenters here and get in touch with them, we can absolutely chat to some of those points. But Michelle or Taylor, did you want to touch on any parts of that from Sid's question?
Yeah, I guess just kind of without knowing too much about the process, you do want to go back and look at your hive controls. Is there anything that you can do to replace the equipment, or maybe have something that can muffle the sound? So just kind of think at a high level that those are certain controls that you can implement. But yeah, definitely reach out and we can maybe chat more to see how we can help you.
Thanks, Michelle. I hope that answers some of your questions, Sid. David McCauley asks, what are the best resources, so websites, books, manufacturers, data, and testing agencies for wall, ceiling, floor construction to reduce sound transmission?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did refer to one, so that was the Acoustical Society of America. So that one, they have guidance documents specifically for classroom design, but there are other ones, I can't think of them on top of my mind, but there are other ones that do exist for certain building acoustics.
Thank you. Jim asks, Jim Hall, you mentioned regulation concerning motorcycle noise. So I'm guessing this is in regards to sort of community noise. Is a distance of measurement included in the regulation?
No, because the way that noise works is the further away you are, the sound dissipates. So it's called the inverse square law. So if you're standing at a source, if you move, say, a meter away, the sound is actually cut in half. And the further away you go, it tends to dissipate. So kind of going back to how I said with the community guidelines, and it ranges between 40 to 60, depending on the type of establishment, you're kind of factoring in how far away you are from your neighbors. But when it comes to like motorcycles or these kind of measurements, we're not really measuring right. Yeah, there's no set, I guess, distance.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. And Emma Bayless says, thanks for the presentation. Curious about noise related to HVAC systems. If you guys know any info off the tops of your heads relating to this.
What exactly do you mean by that? Like how loud the equipment should be operating, or how loud it is inside that particular room? I guess we need a bit more information to get that kind of clarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely, I'm wondering if it's kind of like just general, any concerns Emma added. So I suppose it would be in relation to the running of HVAC system in a mechanical room. Okay, yeah. So I suppose the info related to that, Michelle, can you speak to, the mechanical rooms within a building, any concerns related to HVAC noise produced in a mechanical room is how I'm implying that question.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me.
Yeah, so mechanical rooms are a great example of a big source of noise in workplaces, especially for maintenance staff. So things that you'd want to look for are making sure the pieces of equipment are routinely inspected. If you've got belts that have gone offline or misaligned, you want to make sure that those go back. Like I said earlier, lubricating gears and all the components so that they're actually operating smoothly. So it's more of doing a risk assessment to see what are the hazards that are present and what can be done to control those hazards.
And that's something that you guys have you've done a lot of times. Yeah, wonderful. Any other questions at all? That's all we have in our Q&A right now. We've got a couple of minutes left. So what I would recommend, if anybody has any other questions or concerns, or any of those questions that sort of had some actions attached to them, definitely reach out to Michelle and Taylor. Feel free to take a screenshot of this page here so you can take their contact information. And like I mentioned, we're going to put the webinar up on YouTube within a couple of days. So look for it early next week and we'll send you out a link as well. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. We are going to just move into the very last point here, where I'm going to tell you about our next one, which is going to be the last in our series for the beginning of the year. We're going to talk about safety through the summer. So things related to both what you do at work in the summertime, some heat related things, and then, people are going camping and on vacations into the cottage. So some things that maybe you haven't thought about in regards to safety. So we're hoping that this will be a really useful thing to kick off the summer for us, which is coming soon. So thank you everybody very much for your time. Please take a couple minutes at the end of the webinar to fill out the survey. We really do appreciate your feedback and we listen to it all. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.